Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Justice. We're happy to be here for another week, giving thanks for all who continue to support the organization. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director for JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at JFJ.
So some interesting items happening in the news, and I must say, Jade, despite the fact that Stocks and Securities Limited SSL scandal continues to plague the news cycle, and we do hope that the perpetrators are brought to justice in swift and short order. For those who are keeping up, I think the FBI has been called in.
Yes, there's been quite a few developments. The FBI has been called in. Documents are regularly coming to the public for that people wouldn't expect. It's quite dramatic.
Yes, and there are conversations about the strength of the regulatory bodies and so on. But we won't be delving into the SSL matter or the FSC scandal, as people are calling it, on the JFJ program. But we just wanted to bring it into perspective that we were hard pressed to figure out what happened in our human rights recap, because the SSL seemed to have taken over the entire news cycle.
Yes, it's been very dominant.
All right, but there are things that happened within the human rights landscape that is worth mentioning. Last week, we saw the matter of the compensation being issued to the fisherfolk who were affected by the Rio Cobre fish kill.
Yes.
And Jade, I think you have a greater memory than I do in this regard, in the terms of the update.
Yes, so they would have issued out about 120 checks to fisherfolk that would have claimed losses from the fish kill. I think each check was about 131,000 Jamaican dollars, which would have been splitting up the lump sum that the NEPA would have collected from the company based on the spill. So it
the
started
environment bond, yes.
Yes, so it started up conversations again from advocates in the space as well, like the Friends of Rio Cobre, that the compensatory framework is not sufficient. There needs to be some serious
rethinking, because they didn't even consider the full gamut of how people were affected. And I think one of the important points to note is that the fisherfolk who collected that $131,000, they are now unable to bring any legal action against the state actors, but they can in fact file a civil suit against the private sector company. In this case would be Windalco. So I think that's one of the immediate emerging what you would call consequence of signing. But we understand persons have been severely affected and individuals did what they must, but the legal redress certainly continues for the Rio Cobre community. One of the things that I wanted to touch on last week, we mentioned on the show that there was a video that was circulating on social media, and I think it was Mr. Andre Stevens actually who brought it to JFJ's attention via our Instagram page. So we want to tell Mr. Stevens is his last name, yes, the social media influencer, and he has his own podcast. But I want to express thanks for bringing these things to our attention before it actually came to the traditional media. But one of the things that was shown in that video was a man being beaten by several others down by the Ocherios police station, and they were repeating different homophobic slurs, calling him AIDS infected, which is not a language that we use. We talk about people living with HIV. So quite discriminatory language, very alarming in terms of the assault that was being perpetrated against this individual on the basis that apparently he sexually assaulted a young boy. That's the reason for him being there, they thought. But that wasn't the case. So you see misrepresentation of information. Now, following the airing of our show, we said that we would have done a little bit more research. But before we actually had an opportunity to act, we saw further information emerging in the news cycle that suggested that 5 men were charged for that assault. And following that, there was a standoff between the police down by Ocherios.
Yes, and the
inmates. At one point, persons thought it would have escalated, but thankfully matter was quickly dealt with, and order was restored. But following that, though, what came to light was another video where the inmates were making allegations that the police put them up to it. Now, we're not making any statement about whether or not we believe anything of that nature, but the whole incident really does make us take pause in terms of the contrabands that are being within the lockups, for example, where they get cell phones from to be video taping anything.
Yes.
So there were several causes for concern.
And I think as we go into our conversation for today, we have to consider as well, what's the capacity of this prison? Is it staffed adequately for the correctional officers to have been able to have dealt with any of the issues that would have seen arising?
And interestingly, the police officers said that no. So you had several inmates who were transferred to St. Mary lockup, I believe, and there were calls again from the police officers that the Department of Correctional Services should take charge of the inmates, and then the DCS has always historically said that no, unless these people are convicted, that's when they come into our jurisdiction. But for now, they're yours. So I think there needs to be some ironing out when you talk about overcrowding. The last thing I want to touch on, which is not necessarily within the mandate of JFJ, but it's worth considering, this ticket, and I would say the non-amnesty.
Yes.
That was provided. So if you recall last year, I believe the government indicated that some reprieve would be given to motorists, not just taxi drivers, no. Motorists who had outstanding tickets to make those payments up to January 31. So there are several areas of concern, not to say that there's some 45 persons who had amassed some 500 tickets. In my estimation, personally, not speaking for JFJ, I don't think those things should be forgiven, that many. But it speaks to the inadequacies of the system. And what we're seeing happening now, one, is the difference between public statements made by parliamentarians versus when the law comes in effect. Because the court can't go by public statements and utterances made in parliament. They have to go by when the laws are in fact gazetted. And several attorneys have called JFJ to express concern about whether or not that reference bill, I don't remember the name of it now, the Reprieve Act, if it was just passed last week, by the way,
yes,
in the House of Representatives, and just Friday in the House of Senate. So the question is that bill now in effect that is guiding the reprieve? It's an interesting question to be posing on the last day of this so-called amnesty or non-amnesty. But I think we're seeing the effect it is having on the justice system, Jay, the overcrowding that is happening, and the question is,
absolutely,
you're seeing all the thousands of people out.
But even the court administration division has had to make several statements about basically indicating to persons that we're doing our best. But we are literally not equipped for this volume of persons coming to the court, and you'll find so many reports. Particularly in the Gleaner, I've seen quite a few testimonials from persons who would have traveled all the way to St. Anne, for example, coming from Kingston to deal with a ticket, spent the entire day there, took a day off work. The ticket was not dealt with. And then I even saw a case where someone was saying that they went to St. Anne and then were told that they would need to go back to St. Elizabeth to be arrested, because that is where they received the ticket.
So you're going to walk with the two hands and say, arrest me.
Yes.
But it brings into the question the matter, and again, it's not a human rights issue as we have seen, but it does have implications for our criminal justice system. And I think we just want to say to the parliamentarians that when you're passing laws, let's pass laws within the realities of our justice system, and laws that have some practicality to it. Because we can't say, okay, I'm going to give you a reprieve, and then people take it as, oh, but you wait until the last minute. You should have anticipated that.
Yes.
So, the practicality and common sense, I think, was quite frankly and respectfully to our parliamentarians missing from the conversation. And again, my question is, how is that affecting the matters that are currently before the courts?
Yes.
All right.
I agree. And with that, I'll go straight into our right of the day really quickly. So our right of the day today is your right to private home and family life. And this ensures that your privacy is protected and that certain information that is yours, your personal information, is not to be made accessible to other persons. So that includes your image, that includes biometric and other kinds of information, information about your sex life and health status. And you'll find that there are varying pieces of legislation that help to strengthen different aspects of this right. And I will go quickly into our trivia.
So left people business alone?
Yes,
okay.
Left people business alone. And so our trivia for today, which lines up nicely with our topic related to mandatory minimums, is what is the mandatory minimum and maximum, because there's a minimum and there's a maximum stated in the Act, sentence for illegal possession of a prohibited weapon under the new firearms prohibition legislation. So you can respond to that trivia question on our Instagram pages or Twitter pages via DM, or you can send us a WhatsApp message to 2397583 for a chance to win some credit if you give us the first correct response.
Is that a double one for today? Or
No.
okay.
No.
All right, so just following on the question, I think the trivia question, the government is seemingly going down the path of draconian mandatory minimums, and I want to be very clear that mandatory minimums already exist in law. So we're not saying that there isn't a place for it, because they need uniformity of the sentencing guidelines, which we have. The challenge that we're having is the extended period, the draconian approach to these mandatory minimums. And for today, we're going to be having discussion on the implications of mandatory minimums that was just announced for capital and non-capital murder. We should have been joined by Kenyatta Powell, attorney at law, but he's unable to join us, or if he will, it will be sometime after 1:30. But we're going to definitely be joined by Carla Golato, who is the executive director and human rights advocate of Stand Up for Jamaica. So let's get right into it. The government is moving to amend the Offences of Against the Persons Act to provide harsher penalties for murder. The Minister of Justice, Honorable Delroy Chuck, in outlining the measures during a ministerial statement in the House of Representatives on January 24th, proposed an amendment to increase the mandatory minimum sentence of imprisonment from 15 to 45 years.
Regarding eligibility for parole for capital murder, Section 1CA, increase the mandatory minimum sentence to be served before being eligible for parole from 20 years to 50 years. For non-capital murder, Madam Speaker, where the sentence given was life imprisonment, increase the mandatory minimum sentence to be served before being eligible for parole from 15 years to 40 years. Yes. And where the sentence given was a term of years, increase the mandatory minimum sentence to be served before being eligible for parole from 10 years to 35 years.
Minister Chuck further noted that the government is firmly of the view that proposed amendments will remain within constitutionality, and the government has also received support from the opposition to increase the mandatory minimum sentence, and opposition leader Mark Golding would have stated that the amendment will send a strong signal regarding the government's commitment to crime.
I personally would not object to the idea of raising the minimum for murder and also the period for parole, because we need to make a statement to the society that if you commit murder, you're facing the most stiff possible penalty.
All right, that was the leader of the opposition, Mark Golding, and when he was speaking, he asked for a sunset clause to be inserted into the bill that will be tabled by the government that will see a 2 to 3 year delay period to allow for certain questions in terms of what are the implications of the government's approach, who will be most affected, and whether or not the objectives of the government will meet its intended objectives, for lack of a better terminology. So we're just going to take the break, and then on the other side of the break, we will be joined by Miss Carla Golato. The People's Champion. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. Just want to remind our listeners that they can call the studio lines at 676-4996, or they can make their comments on YouTube because we're live streaming from the JFJ's platform, and they can also WhatsApp their views at 239-7583. Carla, welcome to the program.
Michael, thank you very, very much. Lovely to be here.
I'm not hearing you clearly, Carla.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
A little bit better.
Do you want to turn off the video? Maybe that makes it easier.
I'm not hearing. I think the volume is very low. I'm not sure if it's from my end.
I don't know. Let me see if I can
all right, before we get into, before we ask you some questions, Carla, I just want Jade's legal feedback, just so the listeners can understand what currently exists, because I think persons listen to parliamentarians and they said get the murderers and get the guns, and there is a thought process that somehow the justice system, the judges, are there releasing the murderers and re-releasing them into society after serving a meager 10-year sentence and so on. So Jade, let me ask you, as the attorney, what currently exists in law?
Well, okay. So when I first heard about this intention to even amend the act, I was confused, especially the part of the act that was intended to be amended, because I guess this is not just my opinion, it's also JFJ's position, that the act is sufficient in its current form, which is, so what we currently have is for a capital murder offense, you are given a mandatory minimum sentence of life imprisonment. It's a mandatory minimum sentence of death. But what we find is that it's normally commuted to a life imprisonment sentence, after which you are to serve a minimum of 20 years before your parole can be considered. And where it is a non-capital offense, a non-capital murder, you are to serve up to 15 years before you are considered for parole. That's a minimum. So what happens is that when you go to court and you are convicted, then the court would now determine what period of time they would allot prior to you being able to be considered.
And when it's not a life imprisonment for non-capital, the judge, the mandatory minimum would have been, what, a 10-year period?
Right,
Yeah.
yes. So what would happen is that the court would make an assessment each time that these cases come before them, and then they would determine, okay, the minimum before you can be considered for parole is 20 years, but we are going to set it at 30. Or we are going to set it at 40 because of the facts that have arisen on this case and that would have been brought before the court. So otherwise, they would go with the minimum.
But I love to put it out and spell it out bluntly. Okay, so I'm not an attorney, so I'm not guided by the niceties of language like Jade is. Bluntly speaking to our listeners, life sentence is already provided for in law.
Absolutely.
So the mischief that the government is trying to seek, I'm going to spell out some data quickly. There was a very good editorial in the paper on Sunday. I won't attempt to pronounce the name of the writer, but the writer quoted some statistics from the Planning Institute of Jamaica's through their economic and social survey. And I'm reading from my cell phone here, where the ESS survey found that males accounted for 97.2% of the total adult custodial population. So in other words, those who have been arrested and are behind bars. But I wanted to look at the top 5 reasons for admission. Illegal possession of a firearm, which is 23.5%. Larceny, break-in, larceny of motor vehicle, 12.1%. Sexual offenses, 10.6%. Offenses related to murder or manslaughter, 6%. Breaches of the Dangerous Drugs Act, 4.6%. Now, so in other words, this tough on crime approach that the government is coming with for murder and manslaughter is 6%. Not to say that it doesn't have devastating impact, because the murder rate was at 1,498 last year. But what it suggests is that those who have been convicted and serving a sentence represent 6% of the prison population.
Yes.
Before I get to you, Carla, I want to ask Jade, just lastly, our attorney on the call here, on the program. It's actually turn. She's been interviewed today. Can you explain to the listeners the difference between capital and non-capital murder?
Yes. So in the Offences Against the Person Act, there is a list of offences. I believe it's under Section 2A or 12A. I'm not quite sure of that specific thing, but there's a list of offences that are there's a list of offences, and there's a secondary provision. So within the list of offences, those are what would be considered capital offences. So one example would be for the murder of a member of the security forces. That is considered to be a capital offence that would bring that mandatory minimum of death/life imprisonment that we would have spoken about.
So a member of a jury a witness in a civil or criminal.
Absolutely. So some of the things that we would have identified as being some of the mischief the government is trying to solve, because we would have heard, for example, that people don't want to serve on juries. Some of the reasons given was that they are fearful of retaliation. And we would have also heard the government state that some of the challenges include persons that are... Wow, I kind of lost myself there. But yes, some of the mischief that we're trying to solve is already provided for within the Act. We're quite tough on some of the issues that we're being told we're not tough on.
So capital murder, jury or a juror, security force member, witnesses, justice of the peace. Yes. And when you have multiple people being killed at once.
Right. So yes. So if you have committed a murder that resulted in more than one victim, then yes.
Okay. And I think lastly, and I'm going to use an example for this one, if you commit murder during the course of another crime.
Right. So if you are committing a burglary, for example, and you commit a murder during the course of that burglary, then yes, that's a capital offense as well.
So that's capital. So what is non-capital now?
Everything else. So in all the other periods where a murder has taken place and the person is... it's not any of the circumstances that are listed in that specific section. That is a non-capital murder.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes.
So, Carla, thank you again for joining us. You've heard Jade give the legal side of things. What is Stand Up for Jamaica's position on the government's intent in moving forward with mandatory minimums as high as, 45 or 50 years?
Yes, that is the case.
Thank you, Michael. Let me start with a different approach. Until 50 minutes ago, I was at Tower Street for a special event which was organized by Ministry of Security, Correctional Services, Incarceration Nation, University of West Indies. It was a nice big team, and Incarceration Nation is a group which is working with incarcerated people all over the world. It's the first time that they reach Jamaica, and they start the project for 8 incarcerated people and 2 correctional officers, which will learn how to manage business, musical business, video clip, how to do all musical activities, and become professionals and entrepreneurs. I was sitting there, and it was well packed up. There were people there were superintendents, all sorts of people. In that atmosphere, I was remembering about the interview that I'm doing with you now, and I was asking myself what we were doing there makes sense actually, because what was done today was to set again another activity, another possibility for reintegration, another rehabilitation project, and the idea behind all of that, and the idea is shared by quite an amount of different entities and also agencies from the government, is based on the concept of rehabilitation and reintegration. And behind that again, there is the idea that there is a target which is composed by incarcerated people. We are looking at around 4,000 more people between male, female, and juvenile, which have been in conflict with the law. That means to be straightforward, that they have been committing a crime, right? Those people end in a penal institution, they get a sentence, and they obviously need to pay for the wrong they did. But the concept which I want to discuss today with you guys is what kind of punishment? What is the idea behind punishment? It can be more than one. One can be the famous lock them up and throw away the key, which means somebody has done something wrong. I don't want to hear from him. I want to forget about him. I want to forget about her. And therefore, I just lock him somewhere, and that's it. The other avenue, which obviously is the one that we share, is to use serving time as building time, as a time where those people which have been committing a crime will learn to go back to society in a different way. Because if you look at the numbers offered by DCS and also by the police, they say out of 3 people living in the institution, 1 is coming back. This is among the general population. Among those which are in rehabilitation programs, it is 1 out of 150. So that shows you that if somebody has a second chance, an opportunity, etc., is taking it. And that also means that we build in our society a process where those people who are going back don't keep doing the same wrong things that they did in the past and serve their families and community in a better way. That was the idea. I was also listening to the numbers that you were sharing with the audience 2 minutes ago, which I also was reading the same article. And if you can realize a wide majority is incarcerated for small offenses or medium offenses. Those which are incarcerated for murder, etc., is a very small minority. What this means? Basically, it means that they will go back to society in a short term. It's not that they're going to be incarcerated for the next 500 years. They serve 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So those people are not those which will be affected by the proposal which is on the table actually.
Carla, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought for us. We're going to take the break that's due now, and then we pick up when we return.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We are speaking today about the new proposed mandatory minimum sentences in the Offences Against the Person Act. And we are joined by Ms. Carla Golotho from the Stand Up for Jamaica organization. Before the break, you were giving us a little information about what you think the effect would be as it relates to rehabilitation, which should be one of our goals when we speak about incarcerated persons. But I kind of wanted to shift a little to ask, the government is proposing this change as something that would be a deterrent to persons who are committing these crimes. What is your opinion on that perception? Do you think it will actually be a deterrent? Is harsher penalties really what we need to be doing?
Thank you for this good question. No, it won't not be a deterrent. It will be the opposite. Let me use a word which is hope. Once you abolish the hopes, why there should be somebody behaving in a better way? If somebody has been committing something wrong, and we're talking about murder, so we're talking about heavy wrongness, right? He needs to pay for it, for what he has done. But in rehabilitation, that everybody, by the way, sometimes I wonder, that's why I was talking about today earlier on, because I was wondering, I say, we are doing things all together, including the Ministry of Security, including the university, etc., while somebody in the same government is proposing the famous 40-year and before you can apply for parole. If you go that way, right, and it might happen accordingly, you basically kill any sense of the rehabilitation. Why people should be going through a process of rehabilitation? A rehabilitation, for those which are listening to this program, is not something too theoretical. It is education, like a school diploma. Yes. It is a professional diploma, which will allow you to go to work and have a professional skill. Actually, we have people in the last 2.5 years which have been graduating from the University of the Caribbean.
And Stand Up has been doing good work in this regard as well. Carla, before you continue, I want to read something from this Gleaner article to further the point that you're making, I'm going to ask you to pick up once I read the same article. It stated that from the same report, of the 903 people admitted in 2021, approximately 48.6% of those admitted were unskilled. Only 27.2% were self-employed, and you don't know the income that would have been garnered from that self-employment. 15.3% were skilled workers, and again, skilled workers in our society, it's not a high-paying job. 2.7% were professionals, and 1.6% were security sector professionals, and we all know the salaries where that is concerned. And 0.2% were students. So again, I want to highlight that 48.6% of those who received custodial sentences were unskilled people. So if you look at this correlation, arguably so, between those who have the skills and the ability to earn an income versus those who don't, and the likelihood of them perhaps committing certain crimes and ending up behind bars, I think that data says a lot. And the need, as you are highlighting, Carla, for rehabilitation is not a feel-good exercise, as some people chastise us, if you recall, Carla, during the death penalty conversation. But it is something critical to prevent our youngsters from re-offending. So I'm not sure if you want to continue, if you have anything there to add.
I think that you are making an excellent point, and I am confessing openly that I'm kind of fed up to hear that human rights people defend criminals. Human rights people defend victims, right? The famous women that come to our office, the children, the people which come to your office because they've been abused. This is our people. But what we want to find is to offer people an alternative to them. So if we don't use the concept of throw away the key, 40 years, etc., basically we create a situation where those which have been in conflict with the law won't have any reason to rehabilitate, any reason to learn, any reason to get a professional skill. Therefore, we go back to society worse than what they were. Because prison can also be a school of crime. Because if you do not learn something better, believe me, you can also learn something worse. So the leading idea, which we do not accept in this proposal, is an endless punishment without any possibility for the society to recover those people and transform them in something else, but leave the bad man, the bad women, the bad children, same. So that to me is a failure. That is a total failure, because it is refusing to try to build on a target of X, Y, Z people, which is quite significant, to build something which is reducing the level of crime in the country. And we all need it. So if I can say something which is not very diplomatic, I have the feeling that these proposals which are coming out like this show that the government does not know how to make another proposal. So it's doing something striking to satisfy the need of blood for those which are truly worried about the desperate situation that we are living in the last years, right? People are worried, including myself. I have 4 children. I want a peaceful Jamaica. And instead of trying to make a huge effort, which is going to make changes in the society, and especially in some communities, right? They offer a patch, which is a striking declaration, 40 years. So everybody feels, okay, something has been done. The answer is nothing has been done. It's the opposite, because we are not being fighting crime. We are only being leaving the situation as it is, with an additional problem, which is an increase of population in the correctional institution is terrorizing everybody. Places, institutions like Tower Street, It is an old fort built 300 and something years ago.
That housed slaves, that housed the slaves 300 some centuries ago.
Incarcerated people. Today, when I was there on the blackboard, I was reading 1,780. That means almost 3 times what you should be, right? If you, instead of going on the avenue to find alternatives to crime, if you lock everybody in there, it's going to be a different. And the only thing that you can have is an increase of crime. I don't know why people, instead of reasoning on things, are just taking sometimes emotional stance, which are sometimes due to the lack of understanding, because not everybody knows. Yesterday I was reading on a chat, somebody saying, oh, prisoners are like a club med. Club med? A 5-star hotel? Where you have a cell which can hold 2 people, and in the same cell you have 5 people, and they cannot sleep all together because there is no space. So one is sleeping, one is standing, one is standing, one is sleeping. And all of them from 3 p.m. to the following morning have a single individual bucket where to urinate and defecate in front of the other 4 ones. It is a health hazard because you have a cell with 5 buckets full of whatsoever. And it's such an humiliation. It's a 5-star hotel, please. Before people decide to say certain sentence, we should try all together to learn and talk about something that we know, not that we assume or we heard, etc.
Yes,
So
and
both
human
parts-
dignity is still important, even if you're still behind bars. That's a fundamental human right. So persons will argue, Jade, that, tell you what, these people are criminals. Lock them up. So nothing that Carla is describing, unfortunately, makes a difference for some Jamaicans because...
And you know, 2 things came to my mind immediately. One of our previous cases where the young man was in an overcrowded cell and he died because he suffocated. And then the second thing that comes to mind is Mario Dean as well.
Mario Dean, Ghana, Barnett, so many.
Yes, and then when we think about overcrowding in prisons and the effect that can have on the safety of prisoners, and on the safety not only of prisoners but of the officers that are expected to manage the prisoners in these facilities, there has to be deeper consideration
And
given.
recognizing it's only 6% are murderers.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And others are there for other offenses. And not to say that murderers still don't deserve human dignity.
Right, Miguel, that's why I say short, medium terms are the wide majority.
Yes,
So,
yes.
having a policy which is punishing those which have not a significant amount of people, it doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
Why don't we worry about those which are entering the institution and lives within 4 years, 3 years, 4 years? Why don't we try to make sure that we use that time to redeem them somehow and to give them the instruments to avoid to become reoffenders?
Thank you so much, Carla, for joining us. We have to leave it there. We appreciate your views and we stand in unison with Stand Up for Jamaica on this particular topic. Thanks again.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Jade.
Of course.
All right, we take a break.
Jamaicans, for justice, the people's champion.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We're discussing the implications of mandatory minimums. While we're focusing on the conversation of capital and non-capital murder, I think it's important to have the full discussion, Jade, between the 2 of us when you look at the recent Firearms Act. And I want to point out to the listeners that though Minister Chuck indicated up to the 45 and the 50 years and the 35 and so on for both level offences, the Prime Minister had made some grand announcement before that had suggested that the government would have been contemplating life without parole.
Yes.
Yes, I'm
for
laughing
capital murder.
at how asinine some of these proposals, quite frankly, are. Tough on crime, but are we considering the nuances of it? I know the government is irked when JFJ mentions the fact that they are reducing and disregarding judicial discretion,
yes.
and they challenge us on that, but this is exactly what it is. And again, I say to the Jamaican public that are listening in that you do have mandatory minimums already. The challenge that we're having is when it is set so high, there is no wiggle room for the judge to consider the nuances of certain cases.
Absolutely.
And there are already some things that don't make sense in law. Now, in 2005, the then Parliament had differentiated between capital and non-capital. Before, it was just straight capital murder. 2005, I believe, the amendment was made.
Yes.
So I was explaining to my 14-year-old recently, because we have these conversations, much to his chagrin at times, that the whole conversation of if you are committing a crime and murder happens as a result or during the course of that crime, then it's capital murder. So I gave him the example and I said, son, imagine a 15-year-old who is starving, not saying his actions are correct,
Yes.
but he's a starving young man and he decides to break into a household. During the course of his break-in, the head of the household, let me not use the head for fear of my female colleagues come and chastise me. A member of the household said, what are you doing in the house? Wake up, fling the light on him. What are you doing in the house? Some tussle happens, and during that tussle, the 15-year-old stabs the member of the household, and the member of that household dies. That's capital murder.
Yes.
So let me ask you, the hardened, tough, greyback criminal now that have the illegal weapon, that force little pitney to commit crime, you're telling me that the judge has to fit within what Parliament says is how many years?
It is the minimum.
The 50?
Yes.
So that 15-year-old will get 50 years
Minimum before parole can be considered.
With a hardened, tough, greyback criminal.
Absolutely.
That have crime wreaking havoc in the country. I want people to get the essence of what is happening here, you know.
But, you know, that is what Carla was alluding to, is that you're creating an environment where persons will go to a school of criminality.
Exactly.
Because when that person is ready to be considered for parole, and if they are granted parole, they're coming out with brand new knowledge on how to improve the criminal activity they went into prison for.
Exactly.
And then we also have to consider, I remember reading in the paper, the same article that Carla would have made her comments in, where one of these persons, he was not the murderer. It was an incorrect conviction that was later overturned by the Privy Council.
Yes.
So then we also have to think about those situations where a person is getting a mandatory minimum sentence, and it may turn out that this conviction was not a proper conviction.
But Jade, to add to that point, if you look at even the firearm, we're not fooling ourselves to think that there aren't youngsters who don't have criminal intent and so on, and perhaps long sentences aren't justified. That's not what we're saying. But we're saying that the judges should have that ability to assess those times. Because when you look, recently we cautioned Parliament against this, that don't have a fixed mandatory minimum unless you have some judicial discretion. Now, we caution against it. People say, no, man, there's something in the Child Care and Protection Act that would allow some judicial discretion. Then I heard the Prime Minister come publicly and say, listen, sorry for those 15-year-olds, this is what it is.
Yes.
So, again, a 15, I won't say the years because I think that's your trivia question, the mandatory minimum for firearm act.
Yes, it is.
But I want people to look at these things. Now, we talk about practicality. We see what is happening with the traffic courts right now. Thousands of people show up. I want people to think about it. When you don't have systems in place for plea bargaining, what will happen? Because if it is that I am facing, 50 years mandatory, who going to come to me and say, go plea nowhere?
Yeah.
I'm going to take my chances and try to beat it.
But I think what our government is forgetting is the government itself's previous efforts to deal with what we would have determined is a serious issue with our justice system, which is the court backlog.
Which they haven't fixed despite decades of reports asking for reform to the justice system. You have the pop-down prisons same way that are inhumane. What people don't even know that the government can't even sign on to its international obligations because of the poor conditions of the prison system. You cannot pen your signature to an international treaty, convention rather.
And in the time that we've been talking about this, you know, we've been getting some comments to our social media pages, to our WhatsApp. So we would have seen, so persons are in agreement, you know, which can be rare for us. But persons are in agreement that yes, these mandatory minimums will only cause overcrowding. And we did get a comment from one of our listeners called Tamara, who would have said maybe this is how the Prime Minister is planning to implement the private prison, which is something that JFJ would have also spoken about briefly last year.
No, we cautioned private prison. We didn't put any motive behind the people that mandatory minimums. That's
not what I'm saying.
Let me clarify.
The private prison is what we spoke about. Is all I'm saying. The implication of a private correctional facility is what we spoke about. Yes. And we would have cautioned, yes, that this could be something that could add negative connotations to our human rights framework as it exists now. So I'm just going to quickly give the response to our trivia question. So the correct answer is a minimum of 15 years and a maximum of 25 years. And I'm looking at our producer right now. I'm getting that no one got this right.
Oh, so we couldn't give you the answer.
So we didn't get a correct answer this week. So that's unfortunate for our listeners. That credit will stay in our coffers this week.
But Jade, before, I think we have another 2 minutes to go.
Yes.
And I want persons to remember the conversation that we're having right now. Prison overcrowding, a burdened justice system. The government is just getting to the stage of reducing the court backlog. I've heard the Minister of Justice, for example, lauding the courts that during the COVID period, for example, they've managed to make quite a bit of headway. I think my question to you is just for clarity. That 14-year-old, for example, who last year, and there were several, that was found with an illegal firearm, what would be the sentence for that 14-year-old? That you're facing?
At minimum 15 years.
And 25 years maximum?
Maximum 25, yes.
No possibility of any non-custodial?
The only thing that the court can do, one, they would have to award the sentence. That is not discretionary. The only thing that they could do is allow for the person who has been convicted to make an application on the basis that the judge does not think the sentence is too excessive, and then that person can then make an application to the Court of Appeal, which would reconsider, and then possibly award what would be the recommended sentence from the trial judge. And
that's just a possibility of an appeal, just a possibility,
yes,
no guarantee.
No, absolutely not. And then what we're looking at right now too is that even to add this additional step with our current court backlog, I'm not sure that would be something that would be easily implemented regardless.
All right, so there you have it, the conversation for today in terms of the implications for mandatory minimums. And again, JFJ and I know Stand Up for Jamaica and other attorneys, they are cautioning the government from going down this very bad public policy route. We have to maintain some semblance of understanding of the issues that are before us and allow the courts that level of discretion to be guided by the social inquiries.
I think what we need is a holistic understanding at all times instead of the separate understandings that we keep having.
The preventive measures to crime as well for our youngsters rather than this punitive wait until them commit the act. Then you get something done.
Absolutely.
All right, I think that's it for today's program. Anything else before we close out?
No, I would just want to remind our listeners that this week we are going to be in St. Anne at in the Gibraltar community. Some of those persons affected by Special Mining License 173 will be joining us, and we'll be giving out some information, we'll be giving some legal advice, and you can also come to make any complaints regarding climate issues or other issues that you may be having. So, Jamaicans for Justice in your area this week.
All right, thank you so much. I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director.
And I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist. We'll see you next week at the same time.